Right now, I want to bring in CBS News national security contributor Sam Vinograd, a former Department of Homeland Security official in the Biden administration. Sam, I know you're talking with your sources. What can you tell us? What are you hearing right now?
Well, we've just learned that the FBI has issued a new statement indicating that they are investigating this as an act of terrorism. Now, I will stress, having unfortunately dealt with far too many mass casualty events, we are in the nascent stages of the investigation. There are a range of motivations that could have been employed by this individual who we now have learned is deceased. This could have been terrorism related, it could be criminal in nature, it could be a personal grievance. What we do know is it appears as if a lone actor drove a vehicle into a large mass gathering of individuals on a very high-profile evening, New Year's Eve. These kinds of attacks, unfortunately, have made their way through the course of history. Bad actors of all kinds view holidays like New Year's Eve, Christmas Eve, July 4th as prime opportunities to inflict damage because there are large numbers of people gathered in one place. They can count on that. Bourbon Street was going to be crowded last night, as well as the fact that these are high-profile moments. There's so much media attention during these holidays and these events like New Year's Eve. So these holidays are oftentimes prime opportunities for bad actors of all kinds to inflict damage. So what we now know is that the FBI is taking the lead on the investigation. They're investigating this as an act of terrorism. And at this time, the primary focus is working to ascertain whether this individual did or did not act alone. We are still waiting to hear from law enforcement as to whether this threat has been neutralized and or whether this individual was in touch with anybody else who may be planning similar attacks, Michael.
Sam, we've been talking about this all morning, but down there on Bourbon Street on New Year's morning, there are barricades. There is a large law enforcement presence, and they are aware of the possibility of attacks just like this. Is there anything that can be done to prevent this? We saw this in Germany at the Christmas market, but similar attacks like this, it feels sometimes like there is no way to prevent this.
It may feel that way, and I will note that physical barriers alone are unlikely to stop vehicular attacks of this kind. What is needed is a culture of prevention in this country, whereby when an individual starts making concerning statements, perhaps alluding to plans to inflict damage, that individuals who hear about this or see this on social media immediately contact law enforcement to get help to the individual making these kinds of statements. This looks like a carefully planned attack. The individual had a firearm on his person. He shot 2 officers. There may have been improvised explosive devices in the vehicle. He knew where he was going. And so it is not unlikely that this individual shared even tidbits of his plans with others. So what we need is a cultural shift in this country whereby individuals are mobilized to engage in prevention at the earliest possible stage versus waiting to see whether somebody takes their car or some other kind of asset to inflict damage. But I don't think that all the physical barriers in the world are going to keep these kinds of open air mass gatherings safe from the threat of a vehicular attack.
All right, Sam Vinograd, thank you so much. We're going to continue to check in with you. And joining us now is Mary Ellen O'Toole, former senior FBI criminal profiler, and she's now director of the Forensic Science Program at George Mason University in Virginia. Mary Ellen, thanks so much for joining us. Now we have learned, we have confirmed through law enforcement sources that the suspect is deceased. If you can talk about what work goes on now that we know that the initial threat is over, what takes place now?
Sure. Good morning. Thank you for having me. Well, one of the important things for the FBI and law enforcement to consider, and they are considering that at this point, is are there other events that could occur? And what I mean by that is, did this individual think enough ahead or plan enough ahead to place, for example, an explosive device in another location? So are there still ongoing threats to the public? And they have to discern that and make sure that the general public is safe. Because at this point, we know what we know in terms of what happened in New Orleans, but we don't know if the plan was even bigger and greater than that. So they really do have to plan for that. But now what they're looking at is to better understand when this plan was initially started and what went into it and who else may have known about it. And I know the last person you talked to referenced that, and that's very important. Not necessarily because the person that's responsible, the person that's dead now, not because they had a partner, but because other people may have seen the warning behaviors and just didn't come forward to law enforcement. We do know that these kinds of crimes, they just don't happen in a vacuum. This person who planned this didn't do it as the invisible man. So he had to think about it, plan it, get the weapons. If there were explosive devices, he had to get those, plan those, construct those. So people would have seen his actions, but as important, people would have been aware of his personal philosophies. Again, you don't wake up a warm, loving, kind human being, and then 10 hours later, you attempt to engage in an extreme lethal attack like this. So he would have been espousing all sorts of comments that may have been offhanded and bizarre, but he still would have been on the computer talking to other people and engaging in what we call leakage to talk about what he had planned to do. This is such a sensational attack in so many ways. It's very unlikely that he would have been silent about it beforehand.
Yeah, and I want to ask about that because very often in the early stages of an attack, law enforcement is very careful as to how to characterize it. We don't know the motive yet in this attack, but very early on, the FBI came out and said this was clearly an intentional act, and police even said this person was hell-bent on creating carnage. What about this attack makes it immediately apparent that this was an intentional act?
Sure, it's a great question. And just on the surface, when you look at it, it was New Orleans on New Year's Eve or New Year's morning. There were hundreds of people there, and this person chose that venue. So it wasn't a venue where there were no people, where he could drive fast down the street and bombs could have exploded, or he could have used his firearms. He chose a venue where there were human beings, and he chose to drive into the venue going very fast, using a very large vehicle. And again, that indicates that he wanted to create maximum lethality. So in order to be able to do that, he had to be in the right state of mind. And the right state of mind is, I want to kill and hurt as many people as possible and create as much chaos as possible. Now, if from that there are ideological motivations, they'll find that out. But just on the surface, based on what we can see now, he didn't want to create just a little bit of carnage or hurt a few people. That was not the goal here. If it were the goal, he would have gone someplace else to do it.